On a warm summer night in Arizona, the desert highway stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the moon. A family of 4, returning from a quiet trip, never suspected that their final moments were about to unfold on that lonely road. Their car slowed as a vehicle appeared behind them, headlights flashing insistently. Believing it was a fellow traveler in need, they pulled over to the side of the road. But what stepped out of the shadows was not a man seeking help, it was a predator. Randy GREENAWALT, an escaped convict with nothing left to lose, emerged with cold determination in his eyes. Alongside his accomplice, he forced the terrified family from their car at gunpoint. The father tried to reason, the mother clutched her children close. But GREENAWALT's heart had long been stripped of mercy. Within moments, the night air echoed with gunshots. The family collapsed, lifeless, their dreams and future stolen in a burst of brutality. Their bodies were left on the roadside like discarded objects, a grim testimony to GREENAWALT's capacity for violence. This was not the act of a desperate man. It was the mark of a seasoned killer who had crossed the line long ago. For GREENAWALT, violence was no longer shocking, it had become routine, an extension of who he was. That chilling night was just one chapter in a string of crimes that revealed the true nature of a man who seemed destined to walk the darkest path. To understand how Randy GREENAWALT reached this point, we must trace his steps back through the years, to his childhood, his troubled beginnings, and the decisions that twisted his life into one of unrelenting violence. Born in 1949, GREENAWALT grew up in Arizona, surrounded by the stark desert landscape that mirrored his own harsh and unyielding personality. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, blending into the fabric of small-town life. But beneath that exterior lay anger, impulsiveness, and an inability to control his darker urges. Teachers and neighbors later recalled a boy who struggled with authority, who seemed disconnected from empathy, and who drifted quickly into petty crime.
By his late teens, his path was already taking shape. Petty thefts escalated into more serious crimes, and soon the law began to take notice. What started as youthful rebellion hardened into something more dangerous. He wasn't simply rebelling against society. He was rejecting it entirely. The thrill of transgression became addictive, a drug that pulled him deeper into criminality. GREENAWALT's descent into violence accelerated when he met Gary Tyson, another name that would forever be tied to blood and terror in Arizona's history. Tyson was older, already seasoned in crime, and he became both a mentor and a partner to the younger man. Under Tyson's influence, GREENAWALT learned how to plan, how to manipulate, and, most importantly, how to kill without hesitation. Together, they would leave behind a trail of corpses and fear that haunted Arizona for years to come. The crime on that desert highway was not random. It was the culmination of years of choices, alliances, and a growing appetite for destruction. For Randy GREENAWALT, there was no turning back, and the blood spilled that night was only the beginning. Randy GREENAWALT's life inside prison was supposed to be a lesson in consequence. After the cold-blooded murder of 2 truck drivers, society expected him to spend his life behind bars, paying for the lives he had taken. But in reality, prison became a staging ground for an even darker chapter. Behind the walls, Randy met Gary Tyson, a manipulative career criminal who had built a reputation not only for his ruthless crimes, but also for his powerful influence over others. Tyson was older, cunning, and had long harbored a dream of escaping prison. To him, Randy was not just another inmate. He was a potential ally, someone whose skills and desperation could serve his ultimate plan. By the mid-1970s, the friendship between the two deepened. Tyson shared his vision of freedom, painting escape not as a reckless gamble, but as an inevitable destiny. For Randy, who had nothing to lose and no hope of redemption, the idea was intoxicating.
On July 30th, 1978, the plan came to life. It wasn't a violent breakout with guns blazing. Instead, it was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. During what seemed like a normal family visit, Gary Tyson's 3 sons smuggled in weapons. The guards, who knew the Tyson family well, were caught off guard. In moments, the tables turned. Armed and emboldened, Gary, Randy, and the Tyson brothers forced their way out of Florence State Prison. The escape stunned Arizona authorities. A convicted double murderer and a notorious felon had just walked out of a maximum security facility, aided by family loyalty and sheer audacity. The group quickly stole a car and vanished into the desert. But the men weren't simply on the run. They were hunting for survival. To keep moving, they needed cars, supplies, and above all, secrecy. Unfortunately, that meant anyone who crossed their path was in grave danger. It wasn't long before the fugitives' escape turned into a blood-soaked rampage. A family vacationing in their car, a young couple driving through the desert. Anyone who became a liability was silenced. Randy GREENAWALT, who once claimed he killed only when he had no choice, now found himself part of a gang leaving a trail of bodies across Arizona and beyond. The brutality shocked the nation. Newspapers dubbed the escape the Tyson GREENAWALT murder spree, warning the public that the fugitives were armed, desperate, and capable of killing without hesitation. What began as a prison break had now become one of the bloodiest manhunts in American history. Law enforcement launched a massive pursuit, stretching across desert highways, small towns, and even into neighboring states. But for every step the authorities took, the fugitives seemed to stay one step ahead, until a deadly confrontation finally brought their reign of terror to an end. The manhunt for Randy GREENAWALT and Gary Tyson quickly grew into one of the largest in Arizona's history. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters combed the desert skies, and armed officers patrolled highways and backroads. But the fugitives knew the terrain well, slipping in and out of small towns and avoiding detection with ruthless efficiency. Every time authorities thought they were closing in, another body was found. As the death toll mounted, the fear among residents turned into near panic. Families locked their doors, small towns imposed curfews, and people armed themselves, terrified of the killers lurking somewhere in the desert night. The Tyson GREENAWALT gang had become a ghostly presence, always one step ahead, leaving nothing but death in their wake.
In the shadows of New York's bustling streets during the 1970s, a man named Ricardo CAPUTO was beginning to weave a dark and violent legacy. Born in Argentina in 1949, CAPUTO came to the United States searching for opportunity. But what he brought with him instead was a dangerous mix of charm, instability, and hidden violence. To those who met him, he often appeared polite, intelligent, even soft-spoken. Yet beneath the surface, he carried a volatility that would soon erupt into a series of murders spanning years and countries, earning him the chilling title of the Lady Killer. CAPUTO's life in America started like many immigrant stories. He tried to assimilate, to build relationships, to find stability. But unlike others, he was plagued by severe mental health struggles. Reports would later reveal that he spent time in psychiatric institutions and battled disturbing thoughts. Those who knew him described him as magnetic yet unpredictable, a man who could captivate someone in conversation one moment and display flashes of rage the next. His first known victim was Natalina Lena Marcella Corella, a young woman with her life ahead of her. The two met in New York in the early 1970s, and what began as a seemingly normal relationship quickly turned into tragedy. In 1971, CAPUTO strangled Lena to death in her apartment. The murder was brutal, yet at that time, authorities did not immediately link him as the prime suspect. He fled New York, disappearing before investigators could gather enough evidence to hold him accountable. For years, CAPUTO drifted across the United States and beyond. He was a skilled manipulator, able to reinvent himself in new places, adopting different stories to conceal his past. Women were drawn to him, his charm, his foreign accent, and his air of mystery.
But for Caputo, intimacy often turned lethal. By 1974, he struck again. His victim this time was Judith Becker, a young psychology student from Manhattan. Judith's life revolved around her studies and a future in helping others. But Caputo ended it in an explosion of violence. Once again, he fled, leaving behind little more than a body and confusion. Investigators began to suspect a pattern, but Caputo was already vanishing into the wind, slipping through borders and disguises.
Caputo's crimes were not confined to the United States. His wandering path took him across North and South America, with women left dead in his wake. In Mexico, he was linked to the killing of Laura Griffin, a schoolteacher who trusted him enough to let him into her life. In California, another victim would surface. Teresa Fass, a woman whose fate was sealed the moment she crossed paths with Caputo. Each murder bore similar traits: women who knew him, women who trusted him, and women whose lives were abruptly taken by his violent impulses. He never stayed long in one place, ensuring that by the time authorities pieced things together, he was already gone. What made Caputo particularly elusive was his ability to play roles. At times, he portrayed himself as a gentle immigrant trying to adapt to a new country. At other times, he leaned into a darker persona, manipulative and cold. Behind it all was a man who understood how to mask his crimes, just long enough to escape suspicion. But despite his cunning, the weight of his actions was catching up to him. Families of the victims demanded justice, and police across multiple states began to connect the threads. Caputo had become more than just a fugitive. He was a specter haunting both New York and beyond, a killer who seemed always one step ahead. By the late 1970s, his name was on wanted lists, and investigators began calling him one of the most dangerous fugitives of his era. Yet, for years, Caputo continued to evade capture, traveling under false identities, blending into new communities, and leaving devastation wherever he went. The world knew little of him then, but those who did would remember him as a man who could smile disarmingly while hiding a violent secret, one that would surface again and again in the most brutal ways imaginable. After Judith Becker's murder in 1974, Ricardo Caputo vanished once again, slipping away like smoke into the wind. Investigators in New York were left scrambling, piecing together fragments of his identity, while the man himself crossed borders with ease. By then, Caputo had perfected his double life: the charming drifter who won people's trust by day, and the violent predator who unleashed his demons by night. He fled south of the border, finding refuge in Mexico, where he lived under assumed names. For years, he moved between Mexico City and smaller towns, always careful to reinvent himself. In public, he could be engaging, even charismatic. Neighbors and acquaintances often described him as polite and quiet, but those who got close to him were taking an unthinkable risk. In Mexico, Caputo struck again. His victim was Laura Griffin, a young American schoolteacher who had moved there with hopes of building a new life. Laura had no idea that the man she let into her circle was hiding a history of bloodshed. Their relationship was brief, but it ended in violence. Caputo killed her with the same cold brutality that marked his earlier crimes, once again fleeing the scene before the authorities could close in. But Caputo was restless. He did not remain in Mexico for long. His pattern of constant movement carried him back into the United States, where he sought fresh beginnings. At times, he worked odd jobs, blending into communities that had no idea a killer lived among them. By 1977, he resurfaced in California, where he would add another victim to his grim list. This time, it was Teresa Fass, a woman who had been drawn into his deceptive charm. Just like the others, her life was violently cut short, and Caputo disappeared again before investigators could even build a solid case. The scattered nature of his crimes made him difficult to track. Each murder happened in a different state, or even a different country, leaving law enforcement agencies struggling to connect the dots. Communication between jurisdictions was limited at the time, and Caputo exploited those gaps to his advantage. He lived like a ghost, constantly moving, never staying long enough to raise suspicion. Meanwhile, his family in Argentina and elsewhere had no idea of the true extent of his actions. To them, Ricardo was troubled, yes, but not the cold-blooded killer the authorities would later describe. In truth, his mental instability was severe. Reports suggest he spent time in psychiatric hospitals, where doctors noted signs of dangerous behavior and violent tendencies. Still, his ability to manipulate those around him allowed him to slip back into society each time.
By the early 1980s, Caputo was living under several aliases. He fathered children, attempted to create the facade of a normal life, and even convinced some that he was a victim of circumstance rather than a predator. But behind the curtain, the trail of bodies linked to him continued to grow. What made Caputo especially dangerous was not just the violence itself, but the unpredictability. His victims were not random strangers on the street. They were women who knew him, trusted him, or cared for him. Each time he betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. As the 1980s progressed, his name began to appear more frequently on wanted lists in the United States. The FBI was well aware of him by then, branding him a dangerous fugitive. Still, he managed to stay one step ahead. For more than a decade, Ricardo Caputo remained at large, moving between Mexico, the United States, and Argentina, always evading capture. But no man can run forever. As the years dragged on, the weight of his crimes bore down on him. The constant fear of being caught, the shifting identities, and the memories of his victims all seemed to chip away at his stability. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Caputo was no longer the elusive drifter he once was. He was a man haunted, torn between keeping his freedom and confronting the darkness that had consumed his life. It was this inner torment that would eventually lead him back into the spotlight. After nearly 2 decades as one of America's most wanted fugitives, Ricardo Caputo made a shocking decision, one that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end.
In the tangled world of American crime, few names evoke the same chilling mixture of horror and disbelief as Donald Leroy Evans. Born in 1957 in Watervliet, Michigan, Evans grew up to become a drifter with a violent streak, a man who would later claim responsibility for an astonishing number of murders across the United States. Though many of his confessions were dismissed as fabrications, one crime in particular cemented his place among America's most notorious killers: the abduction and murder of a 10-year-old girl named Beatrice B. Routh in Mississippi. By the late 1980s, Evans was moving from place to place, living in cheap motels, taking odd jobs and drifting through communities without leaving much trace. His background was a patchwork of instability, broken relationships, brushes with the law, and a growing bitterness toward the world. Those who encountered him rarely suspected the depth of the darkness within. In 1991, Evans abducted young B. Routh while she was roller skating near her home in Gulfport, Mississippi. What followed was an unthinkable crime. He assaulted and murdered the child before disposing of her body. The brutality of the act sent shockwaves through the local community, and investigators launched an intensive search to track down the man responsible. Evans was eventually arrested in Louisiana, where he confessed to B's murder. But his confession did not stop there. Once in custody, Evans began making staggering claims, boasting that he had killed over 70 people during his years as a drifter. He described murders stretching across dozens of states, from coast to coast, with details that both intrigued and baffled investigators. Some of the stories matched unsolved cases, while others seemed invented, designed to inflate his image as a fearsome predator. Whether truth or lies, Evans clearly relished the attention.
He portrayed himself as a serial killer on the scale of America's most infamous murderers, a man who operated in the shadows for years before being unmasked. Authorities were left with the difficult task of sorting fact from fiction, and while many of his supposed murders were never proven, his guilt in the death of Beatrice Routh was undeniable.
In 1993, Evans was convicted of B's murder and sentenced to death. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy, with the victim's family finally seeing the man who had stolen their child's future brought to justice. Yet even in the face of a death sentence, Evans continued to taunt investigators with new confessions, weaving a twisted narrative of his life on the road. But the story of Donald Leroy Evans did not end with his conviction. In a shocking twist, just months later, he would stage a daring escape from prison, adding yet another chapter of chaos to his already infamous name. By the summer of 1993, Donald Leroy Evans was already branded as one of the most despised men in Mississippi. Convicted of the brutal killing of 10-year-old Beatrice Routh and boasting of dozens of other murders, he was awaiting further court proceedings under heavy guard. Yet Evans was not finished writing his own story. In a moment that stunned both the public and law enforcement, he managed to do what few thought possible. He escaped custody. On July 12, 1993, Evans was being transported to court in Harrison County, Mississippi. The trip should have been routine, but Evans had been carefully studying his surroundings, looking for the slightest weakness in his guards. As the prison van made its way, Evans seized the opportunity. He overpowered his escort and slipped away, disappearing into the humid Gulf Coast morning. The escape triggered an immediate manhunt. Law enforcement swarmed the area, helicopters circled above, and roadblocks were set up across the county. Residents, already shaken by his crime against young B, now faced the terrifying thought that a convicted child killer was loose in their community. For hours, fear gripped Gulfport and the surrounding towns. Evans, however, was no master escape artist. Unlike his claims of being a seasoned killer who could outsmart authorities across state lines, his attempt at freedom was short-lived. After several hours on the run, he was spotted not far from where he had first fled. Exhausted, disheveled, and unable to blend in, he was quickly recaptured by deputies and taken back into custody. The failed escape only deepened his infamy. In court and in the press, Evans continued to spin stories of his supposed nationwide killing spree, naming victims from California to New York. Detectives spent months chasing leads, trying to separate truth from fabrication. Some of his accounts contained details that matched real unsolved cases, while others were impossible to verify. Many experts concluded that Evans was a manipulator, inflating his reputation to gain attention and notoriety. Still, his confirmed crimes, particularly the murder of Beatrice Routh, were more than enough to secure his place as a figure of horror. Families of missing women watched his interviews and wondered if he had truly been responsible for the disappearances of their loved ones. Investigators faced the grim reality that they might never know the full truth of Evans's claims. His dramatic escape attempt and quick recapture demonstrated not only his desire to defy authority, but also the contradictions in his character. He wanted to appear larger than life, a killer who could roam free and unstoppable, yet in reality, he was reckless and easily caught. For the justice system, Evans was now firmly locked away, his death sentence intact, and his brief taste of freedom a bitter memory. But his story was far from over. In the years that followed, life inside prison would bring him into new conflicts, ones that would ultimately end his life in the most violent way imaginable. Back behind bars, after his failed escape in 1993, Donald Leroy Evans settled into what would be the final chapter of his life. Officially condemned for the murder of Beatrice Routh, and still boasting about dozens of other killings,
He remained one of Mississippi's most notorious inmates. Prison life, however, was not one of silence or reflection for Evans. It was another stage on which he performed his twisted persona. From his cell, Evans continued to write letters, file motions, and give interviews. He portrayed himself as a criminal mastermind, insisting he had murdered over 70 victims across the country. Some investigators entertained his claims, reopening unsolved cases in the hope of connecting the dots, while others dismissed him as a manipulative attention seeker who thrived on shocking the public. Either way, Evans was successful in keeping his name alive in newspapers long after his conviction. But inside the prison walls, his reputation worked against him. Other inmates viewed him with hostility, not only because of his crimes against a child, but also because of his arrogance. Evans often antagonized guards and fellow prisoners alike, feeding the perception that he was dangerous, volatile, and incapable of remorse. By the late 1990s, Evans was housed at Parchman Penitentiary, Mississippi's most infamous prison. Known for its harsh conditions and violent population, Parchman was a place where survival depended on respect or fear. Evans had neither. His constant bragging and the nature of his crime made him a target. On January 5, 1999, Evans's story came to a brutal end. While locked in his cell, he was attacked and strangled to death by another inmate. The killing shocked few within the prison system. Many believed that Evans had been living on borrowed time. For a man who had claimed to take dozens of lives, his own death came swiftly and violently, without ceremony or warning. His murder closed the book on one of Mississippi's most unsettling cases. For the family of Beatrice Roth, Evans's death brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some saw it as justice delivered at last, while others lamented that he never lived long enough to fully face the punishment handed down by the courts. Evans left behind a legacy clouded with uncertainty. His conviction for B's murder is undisputed, but the truth about his alleged nationwide killing spree will likely never be known. Whether he was truly responsible for dozens of other murders, or whether he was simply a pathological liar inflating his own myth, remains a question without an answer. What is certain is that Donald Leroy Evans lived and died as a symbol of manipulation, cruelty, and wasted life. His brief escape in 1993, his endless stream of confessions, and his violent death in prison all form a narrative of chaos and destruction that mirrored the man himself. In the end, he could not outrun justice, nor the wrath of those around him, and his name endures as a chilling reminder of how evil can thrive in the most ordinary of disguises. In the quiet Canadian town of Miramichi, New Brunswick, life in the 1980s was simple and predictable. Families left their doors unlocked. Neighbors trusted one another, and crime was rarely more than petty theft. But in the years that followed, this peaceful image would be shattered by the terrifying crimes of one man, Allan Joseph LEGERE, who would become known as the monster of the Miramichi. LEGERE was born in 1948, and from an early age displayed troubling behavior. By his teenage years, he had developed a reputation for theft and aggression. Over time, his criminal activities escalated, and by adulthood, he was a seasoned offender, frequently in and out of trouble with the law. Still, no one could have predicted the level of violence he would later unleash. His descent into infamy began in 1986, when a robbery turned fatal. Alongside two accomplices, LEGERE broke into the home of shopkeeper John Glendenning. The crime quickly spiraled out of control. Glendenning was brutally beaten to death, and his wife, Mary, was viciously assaulted. The community was horrified, and police quickly apprehended LEGERE. At his trial, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For most, this would have marked the end of his story. Locked away in maximum security, LEGERE was expected to spend the rest of his days behind bars. But he was cunning, manipulative, and far from finished. He bided his time in prison, watching for any weakness, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in May 1989. While serving his sentence, Legere complained of an ear infection and was transported from prison to a civilian hospital for treatment. It seemed routine, a convicted killer being moved under guard for medical care. But Legere had smuggled a homemade key, crafted from the metal frame of his prison glasses. As guards escorted him through the hospital, he made his move. In a shocking moment of desperation and precision, Legere overpowered his escort, unlocked his restraints, and slipped away. The escape was an embarrassment for authorities and a nightmare for the residents of Miramichi. Within hours, news spread that a convicted murderer had escaped custody, but no one yet realized just how catastrophic his freedom would become. Allan Legere was no longer just a criminal, he was a predator on the loose, and he was about to turn Miramichi into the stage for one of the most terrifying killing sprees in Canadian history. In the quiet Canadian town of Miramichi, New Brunswick, life in the 1980s was simple and predictable. Families left their doors unlocked. Neighbors trusted one another, and crime was rarely more than petty theft. But in the years that followed, this peaceful image would be shattered by the terrifying crimes of one man, Allan Joseph Legere, who would become known as the monster of the Miramichi. Legere was born in 1948, and from an early age displayed troubling behavior. By his teenage years, he had developed a reputation for theft and aggression. Over time, his criminal activities escalated, and by adulthood, he was a seasoned offender, frequently in and out of trouble with the law. Still, no one could have predicted the level of violence he would later unleash. His descent into infamy began in 1986, when a robbery turned fatal. Alongside two accomplices, Legere broke into the home of shopkeeper John Glendenning. The crime quickly spiraled out of control. Glendenning was brutally beaten to death, and his wife, Mary, was viciously assaulted. The community was horrified, and police quickly apprehended Legere. At his trial, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For most, this would have marked the end of his story. Locked away in maximum security, Legere was expected to spend the rest of his days behind bars. But he was cunning, manipulative, and far from finished. He bided his time in prison, watching for any weakness, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in May 1989. While serving his sentence, Legere complained of an ear infection and was transported from prison to a civilian hospital for treatment. It seemed routine, a convicted killer being moved under guard for medical care. But Legere had smuggled a homemade key, crafted from the metal frame of his prison glasses. As guards escorted him through the hospital, he made his move. In a shocking moment of desperation and precision, Legere overpowered his escort, unlocked his restraints, and slipped away. The escape was an embarrassment for authorities and a nightmare for the residents of Miramichi. Within hours, news spread that a convicted murderer had escaped custody, but no one yet realized just how catastrophic his freedom would become. Allan Legere was no longer just a criminal, he was a predator on the loose, and he was about to turn Miramichi into the stage for one of the most terrifying killing sprees in Canadian history. By late 1989, the pressure on authorities to capture Allan Legere had reached its peak. Months of terror had devastated Miramichi, and the public demanded an end to the nightmare. Investigators knew that if they didn't act soon, more lives would be lost. On November 24, 1989, their chance came. Acting on a tip, police located Legere near a wooded area outside of town. After a tense chase, officers finally cornered him. This time, there was no escape. The man who had haunted an entire community for 7 months was once again in custody. Relief swept across Miramichi. The monster was caged. But the story didn't end there. In 1991, Allan Legere went to trial for the 4 murders committed during his escape.
The prosecution presented a groundbreaking form of evidence: DNA analysis. It was one of the first times in Canadian history that DNA was used in a criminal trial, and it proved decisive. Hair and blood samples tied Legere directly to the killings, erasing any doubt about his guilt. He was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. For the families of his victims, justice had finally been served, though nothing could erase the scars of what he had done. Legere was transferred to a maximum security facility, where he remains to this day. His name continues to evoke fear in New Brunswick, a reminder of how one man's rampage shattered the peace of an entire community. The legacy of Allan Legere is twofold. He is remembered as one of Canada's most brutal killers, a man whose crimes were marked not just by murder, but by cruelty and sadism. At the same time, his trial stands as a landmark moment in Canadian law, proving the power of DNA technology in securing justice. For the people of Miramichi, however, the scars run deeper than legal history. They remember the fear that crept into their homes, the nights spent locked indoors, and the neighbors who never came back. Allan Legere's reign of terror may have ended in 1989, but the memory of the monster of the Miramichi still lingers, a grim warning of how quickly peace can be destroyed by a single man's violence.
In the era before serial killers were pillars in the news, one of North America's most terrible and prolific killers was a man named Earle Nelson. He was born Earle Leonard Farrell in San Francisco, California, on May 12, 1897. His parents, James C. Farrell and Fanny Nelson, died of syphilis before the boy was 2 years old. Earle found a home with his maternal grandparents, Lars and Mary Jenny Nelson, who were raising their own 5 children. The family lived at 3525 20th Street in San Francisco. Lars and Jenny were Pentecostals who raised children to believe sex outside of the marriage bed, even the thought of it, meant sure damnation. Earle's childhood was marred by illness and near brushes with death. Earle almost died from diphtheria at age 9. When he was 10, he was hit by a streetcar while riding his bicycle. He sustained an injury to his temple and remained unconscious for 6 days. Earle recovered physically. Mentally, he was never the same. He suffered from bouts of headaches, memory loss, and a developed morbid disposition. Earle became a withdrawn and sullen child, afraid of anything God might regard as unholy. After all, such things took his parents away. Earle was expelled from school at age 7. He talked to people no one else could see and quoted scripture at the top of his lungs, scriptures that mentioned the beast. As a preteen, Earle refused to eat the food prepared for him. Instead, he threw scraps of food on a plate and mixed it with a bottle of olive oil. Earle would slurp this meal from his plate instead of with silverware provided to him. His aunt would later say that Earle ate 5 times more than a child his age should. When his grandfather offered him clean clothing, Earle traded it for ragged clothing. Lars died in 1904, and Jenny followed in 1907. 14-year-old Earle went to live with his aunt, Lillian. Earle obsessively changed his clothing. He preferred tattered rags over a new suit. Earle refused to interact with anyone outside of the family. He especially shunned relationships with other children. Instead of talking with Lillian's female visitors, Earle would lift heavy objects with his teeth or walk on his hands. Though Earle wasn't tall, he developed distinctively large hands and feet. The Nelson family possessed traditional Scandinavian features, but Earle's father was a swarthy man of Spanish descent, a trait that Earle inherited. Lillian became afraid of Earle when he started saying dirty things to and about her daughter. He even peeked at the girl when she dressed. Though Lillian loved him, she gave Earle money to sleep somewhere else. Earle adopted the religious beliefs of his grandparents. When he walked with his face pointed toward the sky, as if he were looking up to heaven. He carried a worn Bible in his arm and read from it during idle times. He wouldn't read anything else. Earle began spending his time in the red light district of San Francisco, where he had his first sexual experiences.
Earle also started drinking to excess. He was arrested for robbery on July 28, 1915, and sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin State Prison in California. In 1917, Earle enlisted in the United States Army, but deserted 6 weeks later. He next used an alias to join the Navy but deserted again. In 1918, a naval psychiatrist had him committed and declared Earle was in a constitutional psychotic state. After 2 escapes, he was discharged on May 17, 1919. The constant suppression of lascivious thoughts begat new, bigger ones, and Earle did his best to not act on them. Then, on May 19, 1918, Earle pretended to be a plumber and gained entry to the home of Charles Summers. He encountered Charles' 12-year-old daughter, Mary, and tried to assault her sexually. Mary screamed as loud as she could, which alerted her older brother, who came to the rescue. Earle fled, but police caught up and arrested him. The judge sent Earle to Napa State Mental Hospital after finding him insane. Doctors believed Earle was incurably insane and recommended he remain institutionalized for life. Instead, Earle escaped 3 times, and the staff quit bothering to return him. Between these escapes, Earle worked at a hospital as a janitor and even married one of the nurses. Earle's new wife was 38 years his senior. During the marriage, Earle refused to bathe and was prone to violent outbursts. Mary left her young husband shortly after the marriage began. Little did anyone know, the worst was yet to come with Earle Nelson. On February 20, 1926, 55-year-old Clara Newman was strangled to death. Clara owned a rooming house at 2037 Pierce Street in San Francisco and had a sign in the window advertising a vacancy. At 1:30 p.m., a man came in and asked Clara to show him the room, which was in the attic. Her nephew, Merton, lived downstairs. He saw the man enter with Clara and provided a description. He was about 30 years old, 5'7", and wore an army shirt with civilian pants. He had a dark complexion, though he wasn't black. He wasn't in the attic long before he came down and said to Merton, "Tell the lady I'll be back in about an hour to rent that room." The man never returned. After an hour, Merton went to check on Clara and discovered her lifeless body with a cord wrapped tightly around her neck. Merton called the police, who found no trace of the murderer. On May 2, 1926, 65-year-old Laura Beal, owner of the Deer Park Apartments in San Jose, California, was found strangled to death. Her husband found her corpse on a bed in a vacant apartment, strangled with the silk belt from her dress. Further examination revealed Laura was also raped. A little over a month later in San Francisco, 63-year-old rooming house owner Lillian St. Mary was murdered in a vacant rental room. Like the others, Lillian had been strangled after a struggle. The police suspected Lillian, Laura, and Clara were killed by the same attacker. They were landladies around the same age. The newspapers began calling the attacker the Dark Strangler and the Gorilla Killer, due to his large hands and long arms. Police suspected the perpetrator was a patient at one of the Bay Area asylums and began examining such records. Meanwhile, the killings continued. Ollie Russell of Santa Barbara was strangled on June 24th. Mary Nisbet was strangled with a towel in Oakland on August 16th. Both women were middle-aged landladies, showing a vacancy. The California killings stopped for a while, though similar crimes began in Portland, Oregon. On October 19, 1926, Beata Withers was murdered by strangulation and then raped. The murderer stuffed her body in a trunk, found by her 15-year-old son. Virginia Grant, age 59, was killed in the same manner the very next day. The day after that, Mabel Fluke's body was discovered in the attic of her boarding house. The Portland murders stopped almost as quickly as they began, though activity resumed in San Francisco. On November 18, 1926, 56-year-old Anna Edmonds was strangled to death with a rag and raped in her San Francisco home. The next day, the dark stranger attacked a pregnant woman named Mrs. H.C. Murray of Burlingame, California.
Mrs. Murray placed an advertisement for a room in her home at 1114 Grove Avenue. At 6 p.m., a man who fit previous descriptions of the strangler arrived to view the vacancy. He attacked her almost as soon as he entered the home, but Mrs. Murray fought back. She scratched his face and hands and screamed so loud the neighbors came. The 8-month pregnant woman survived, but the strangler fled. The fact that Mrs. Murray survived spooked the strangler. He left California for the Pacific Northwest. This time, the killer struck in Seattle, where he murdered Ms. Florence Monks on November 23, 1926. The killer ransacked the home and made off with over $10,000 in jewelry. 6 days later, in Portland, Blanche Myers was strangled in her home. Blanche also offered rooms for rent. After death, her killer raped her body and placed her on a bed. This time, police found fingerprints on her wrought iron bedposts. Edna Gaylord operated a rooming house in Portland. Her tenant, Sophie Yates, revealed that before the murder of Blanche Myers, a shabbily dressed man came to the home around 10 a.m. He was short and stocky, with a dark complexion. He tipped his tattered hat at Ms. Yates and introduced himself as Adrian Harris. Adrian rented a room, sight unseen, and the three hit it off. Adrian even purchased a Thanksgiving dinner when Edna complained she couldn't afford one herself. Although he paid a week's rent, he vacated the room 2 days early. When he did, he gifted the ladies several pieces of expensive jewelry. Edna went directly to the police, who confirmed that the jewels belonged to Florence Monks. December 23, 1926, the strangler made an appearance in Iowa when Almira Berard was strangled in her Council Bluffs home. Initially, the crime wasn't linked to the dark strangler, until an examination proved that she was also raped. A neighbor last saw Almira with a shabbily dressed man of about 30 years old who called himself Mr. Williams. The killer drifted south to Kansas City, Missouri, where on December 27th, he raped and murdered 23-year-old Bonnie Pace. The very next day, Germania Harpin suffered the same fate. Germania's infant son, Robert, was home during the killing. The assailant strangled the 8-month-old baby with a diaper, and Robert became the youngest victim. Both women had a "for rent" sign displayed.
The strangler ceased his activity for 4 months while he made his way east. Then, on April 27, 1927, he murdered Mary McConnell in her Philadelphia home. The McConnells had been trying to sell their home for a year. A "for sale" sign hung in the window. She was 53 years old. The next day, the killer tried to pawn jewelry stolen from Mary. Almost a month later, the murderer traveled to Buffalo, New York. He raped and murdered Jenny Randolph on May 30, 1927. Jenny recently lost her son and worked at the YMCA to take her mind off of her grief. She also let out rooms for extra income. On May 27, a man inquired about a vacancy. Jenny's brother Gideon Gillette answered the door that day. The prospective tenant introduced himself as Charles Harrison, a painter from New York, and fit the descriptions of the strangler. After the New York crimes, the strangler moved on to Detroit. On June 1, 1927, police broke down the door of a second-floor apartment when the owner complained the lights remained on for 3 days. Once inside, they found the bodies of 29-year-old Maureen Oswalda Torthy and her 59-year-old landlady, Fannie Mae. The home was ransacked, and both women were strangled. The killer left Detroit and went to Chicago, where he committed his last murder in the United States. On June 2nd, Mary Sietsma was found dead in her home with a wire around her neck and her skull crushed. There was no trace of the killer. The killer slipped into Canada unnoticed. On June 8th, a man calling himself Mr. Woodcotts checked himself into Mrs. Hill's boarding house at 133 Smith Street in Winnipeg. That day, 14-year-old Lola Cowan went door to door in her Winnipeg neighborhood, selling artificial flowers made by her sister, Marjorie. She never came home. Mr. Woodcott left suddenly and didn't close the door to his room. Mrs. Hill came in to clean the now vacant room and failed to check under the bed. She rented the room out again within 3 days. The new tenant discovered the body of little Lola shoved beneath the bed. She had been savagely mutilated and raped. Meanwhile, Emily Patterson was murdered on June 10, 1927, also in Winnipeg. Her killer stuffed her body under her son's bed. He also stole a whipcord suit, a gold wedding ring, and $70. Immediately, Canadian police broadcasted a description of Mr. Woodcott over the radio. They also cautioned women not to allow strangers into their houses under any pretense, especially to rent a room. They offered a $1,500 reward for information, leading to the arrest of the person responsible. Police recognized that the man they sought was the Dark Strangler of the United States. Investigators predicted the killer would head back to the States and alerted railroad employees to be on the lookout. The day after the Patterson murder, a local jeweler named Fred England purchased a wedding ring and suit that turned out to be those stolen during the crime. The man who sold the items went to the barber shop next door for a shave and a haircut. Dried blood and scratches covered the man's scalp. When the barber, Nicholas Tabor, asked about them, the man grew irritable and told him not to touch the injuries. Several reports of strangler sightings came from across Canada. On June 16, 1927, police in Killarney, Manitoba, arrested a man who matched the strangler's description. The man called himself Virgil Wilson, was calm and collected. He was not the raging, murderous devil the constables expected. Nevertheless, constables kept him in jail, intending to rule him in or out. Virgil found a file in his jail cell and used it to escape that evening. He attempted to flee to the States by hopping on a train. The train he chose happened to be transporting members of the Winnipeg police. Within 12 hours, Virgil found himself jailed at the Rupert Street police station. Constables booked him in and took his picture and fingerprints. The photograph was distributed to police stations throughout Canada and the United States. Several witnesses confirmed that Virgil Wilson was the same man they encountered during the U.S. murders. San Francisco police matched Virgil's fingerprints to those of Earle Nelson. They also matched fingerprints and teeth marks to those found at crime scenes. Earle Nelson was the Dark Strangler. At first, Earle admitted the crimes. Later, he recanted his confession and insisted he was innocent. Earle Nelson's murder trial was scheduled to begin on June 27, 1927. His attorney, James Stitt, requested a postponement, which was granted. The trial began November 1, 1927, in Winnipeg, and was heard by Justice Andrew Dysart. The prosecutor was R.B. Graham. Earle's ex-wife testified that Earle was insane and couldn't be responsible for his actions. Many other witnesses placed him near the scene of his Canadian crimes. It was indisputable that he possessed Emily Patterson's jewelry and that he rented the room where Lola Cowan's body was found. Attorney Stitt didn't attempt to argue Earle's innocence. Instead, he asked the court for clemency because Earle was insane. The jury took no pity on Earle, sane or not. Earle Nelson was handed a swift death sentence on November 5, 1927. Early on the morning of January 13, 1928, Earle Leonard Nelson was hanged for the murders of Emily Patterson and Lola Cowan at the Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg. Earle's last words were, "I am innocent. I stand innocent before God and man. I forgive those who have wronged me
and ask forgiveness of those I have injured. God have mercy. Earle Nelson was only convicted of 2 murders in Canada. An American trial would have only prolonged his sentence in Canada. Still, irrefutable evidence proves he was responsible for the killing of at least 20 women.